We're just so excited to talk about the time that Jesus spent with the Nephites and the Lamanites in the New World. And we're going to give a perspective here that might be helpful as you read these chapters. And this is a covenantal perspective. No surprise, we've been talking about covenants a lot, and actually so has God. The scriptures are very much focused on his covenants with us and the covenants he's offered us so that we can return back to his presence. And let's just spend, just as a review, a reminder of the two major covenants from the ancient times, from the time of the Bible. It's two covenantal mountains. We have the Abrahamic covenant, and symbolically we might say that that comes from Mount Moriah. And then we have the Sinai covenant with Moses and the Israelites after God had saved them from Egyptian bondage. And we'll just put Sinai here. And so the covenant path, in some ways, crosses right between these two mountains, and it is Jesus that binds us all together. And as we've talked about just briefly, the Abrahamic covenant is all about God's promises to us. The Mosaic covenant is what God invited us to promise to him. So it's our promises to God. And this is summarized by the Ten Commandments, which explain or offer a pathway for us to show our loving loyalty back to God. When God offered this covenant, he basically said, here's how I would like for you to show me your love and loyalty so that you can prosper in the land. Okay, so that's just the overview. Now, let's make this even more exciting. Let's think about the time of Jesus. He gives the Sermon on the Mount. And what I love about the gospel writers and the scripture writers is that they have so many interesting ways to teach us. And often they're packing learning opportunities into the scriptures that they don't tell us about, but we can sometimes see with a little additional insight and study. And let's map this out. If you think about the first 5 chapters of the Gospel of Matthew, let's just map these out real quick. Matthew 1, Matthew 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now what turns out is that there is a strong suggestion that the writer of Matthew modeled at a high level each of his first 5 chapters on the first 5 books of Moses, which is also known as the Torah. And in a minute, you're going to see how it connects to covenants. And then we'll tie it into why Jesus is sharing an updated version of the Sermon on the Mount for the people in the New World. So let's take a look at this. Matthew 1 has a bunch of genealogy. In some ways, it's a bit like Genesis. There's just a lot of genealogy. And in some ways, it's kind of the introduction to the grand story where you introduce all the characters in the story. Matthew 2 is a bit like Exodus. And it's interesting, in Matthew 2, Jesus both goes into Egypt and returns. And a little bit like how the Pharaoh had threatened the life of the Israelites, so was the life of Jesus threatened. Matthew 3, Jesus gets baptized, priesthood ordinances, is related to the book of Leviticus, which is the instructional manual for the priests for how to run all the priesthood ordinances. Matthew 4 is where Jesus spends 40 days wandering in the wilderness. And what do the Israelites do in the book of Numbers? But they actually wander for 40 years in the wilderness seeking God. Then finally, right before they enter the Holy Land, Moses summarizes the entire Mosaic covenant again before they go in the Holy Land. And the entire book of Deuteronomy is this covenant. In fact, Deuteronomy is a fancy word that literally means second law, or second telling or teaching of the law. So essentially, Moses gets on a mountain and delivers the law to the Israelites before they enter into the Holy Land. Well, let's think about this. Matthew 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What happens in Matthew 5? Jesus gets on a mountain as the new Moses and delivers an update to this covenant. He basically updates Deuteronomy, updates the stipulations, updates what we should be promising to God, updates how we show our faithfulness to God. And so the Sermon on the Mount is the update to the covenant. And so, sure, if you were a Jew living in the time of Nephi, the way you'd show your loving loyalty to God in the covenant is by keeping the Ten Commandments. In the time of Jesus, Moses said, here's the stipulations for how to show loyalty to God. I now say unto you, do these things. And so this is what modern revelation's about. Well, in the time of Jesus, it would have been modern revelation, is that God will update the stipulations for showing loyalty in order that we might have full access to the promises he offers us. So with this perspective, I want you to think about how what Jesus does for the Nephites now is something similar. He comes and says, you have been living these stipulations, these commandments. Good job. Well, in some cases you weren't. But let me give you an update for how to show love and loyalty to God in the covenant. And in our day, we have modern day prophets, and they reveal to us the will of God. And every now and then there are updates on the expectations that God provides for us for how we live faithfully to him. Now, what's interesting is there's a summary statement that shows up both in the Sermon on the Mount in the New Testament, as well as here in 3rd Nephi. It's very significant. And sometimes we misunderstand it a bit as members of the church. I know that I'm a perfectionist and I have struggled with this phrase in the past. And let me share it with you. It shows up at the very end of the first chapter of the Sermon on the Mount, both in Matthew 5 and in 3rd Nephi 12. It is here in verse 48. After laying out many of the updated stipulations of like how to be faithful to God, Jesus says, I would that ye should be perfect, even as I or your Father who is in heaven is perfect. Now let's unpack this just a bit. There's some interesting things going on. This phrase perfect, as I mentioned, has caused consternation and worry for people because we feel this need like, I gotta make myself perfect. And actually it's interesting. There's only one person that can truly make you perfect, and that's Jesus. All that Jesus asks is for our loving loyalty. Now let's actually use a marriage metaphor. I'm sure my wife would love to be married to a perfect man. I'm not quite there yet. If, however, she has a loyal husband, that's actually sufficient. I may make mistakes, but I'm loyal. I'm completely committed to my wife. We are in a covenantal relationship, and I am loyal to that. I may not be perfect, but I'm loyal. Similarly, she's loyal to me. And that's what God offers us. He has always been loyal to his people. Always, always, always. And he wants our loyalty back. So it turns out that in a covenantal context, the word perfect actually can mean loyalty or faithfulness. And I find that very helpful because I cannot be perfect, and I shouldn't try to be perfect because then I'm denying Jesus. And let me explain that just briefly. Only Jesus can truly make me perfect in the sense that I have no sin. Only Jesus can do that. I have to reach out to receive that from him, but that's through my loyalty and my faithfulness. And as a reminder, sacrament every week is an opportunity for us to declare our loyalty and our faithfulness to God. And so we actually are showing covenantal perfection by partaking of the sacrament every week. God does not make the gospel super hard. Now, life is hard, but he tries to keep it simple. Just love me, he says, and love your neighbor. So we read this again with that new context that the word perfect in a covenantal context means faithful or loyal. It says, I would that ye should be loyal or faithful in the covenant, even as I or your Father who is in heaven has been loyal and faithful to his covenant. So this one phrase is all about the two mountain covenants. God has always been loyal to us. All he wants from us is to be loyal to him. And he's now, with the Sermon on the Mount, given some updated instructions for how to show our faithfulness. And just out of interest, when you compare the Sermon on the Mount to what we find in the Book of Mormon, there's sometimes some small but very significant differences. And one I'll point out right here in verse 48 is when Jesus is with the Nephites, he says, I would that you should be perfect, even as I or your Father who is in heaven is perfect. Back in the old world, when Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount, he did not include himself, which is a little curious. We know that Jesus was sinless. He was, for all intents and purposes, perfect. But if we think about it from a covenantal context, Jesus had not yet fulfilled all the obligations the Father had. It wasn't that Jesus was unfaithful. He had not yet completed the fullness of what God had asked him to do. And so in the Sermon on the Mount, in the old world, Jesus did not include himself in that perfection. Even though Jesus was fully righteous, he had not yet fully completed the will of the Father. So now when he comes to the Nephites, Jesus has fully drunk of the bitter cup, has fully fulfilled the will of the Father. And with that full completion, he now includes himself in this phrase, be therefore fully faithful, fully loyal, even as I or your Father who is in heaven is perfect. So our invitation to you, there's many ways of reading this beautiful sermon that Jesus offers, is to consider the covenantal context and to listen for what is God asking for us today so that we can be more faithful and more loyal. And at a minimum, what I hope is you don't spend the years that I did feeling really anxious that I wasn't yet perfect, and realize God doesn't need perfect people because his Son will help make that happen. He needs a faithful people. And actually, I think all of us can be faithful. Do we fall from time to time? Sure. But if our hearts are with God, our faithfulness and loyalty will bind us to a faithful God who will bring us perfection through his Son, Jesus Christ.